Between Two States. The cover of my novel suggests the national flag of Italy, but there's a family walking in the central stripe, separated. Both the parents and the two children are split from each other. In this story, the two states are two countries, Scotland and Italy, but they also suggest the rift in a family and the tensions within individuals, the divided loyalties of an immigrant. The people in this story are caught between two states. I want to pick out 3 important strands in this novel. First, my starting point was the dramatic family history of my husband, the artist Antonio Pacitti. He was born in Cassino, an ancient Italian market town with a famous monastery, Monte Cassino, at the top of a high mountain. The dictator Mussolini was in power, and Antonio's father, Vincenzo, was an anti-fascist. He's the figure on the left, and you feel in the photo that he isn't scared of a fight. When Antonio was almost 4, his father had a street fight with the local fascists. They pronounced a sentence. He had 24 hours to leave Cassino. In panic, he decided to go to Glasgow, where he had socialist contacts. That night, his wife, Philomena, had to make an agonizing decision. She had to decide which 2 of the 4 children, a girl and 3 boys, to take with them to Scotland, and which 2 to leave behind in the care of an aunt. The family had a hard life in Glasgow, which was suffering industrial decline in the late 1920s and 30s. In this photo, you can see Antonio on the right with his brother Lenny, wearing 2 large clothes and uncomfortable shoes doled out by the parish. He had some teasing at school for being Italian. There was another person in the family, a very forceful character, who had made the journey from Italy to Scotland and had actually been deported back. This was the older Antonio Pacitti, the grandfather. He left Italy with a girl he had got pregnant, and like many Italians, started with an ice cream cart, which grew into a prosperous restaurant business. But then he shot a man he believed was making love to his wife, and after a spell in an asylum, was deported to Italy. He returned to the tiny mountain village in the Molise where he had grown up and longed for his life in Scotland. When the Second World War reached Cereswallo, he defied the German soldiers who demanded they should occupy his house. So you see, it's a dramatic story, with migration between Italy and Scotland going on through the generations. There's huge loss, and also resilience, and the making of new lives in a new country. There's a strong cast of characters in both countries. I felt that this real-life story was gold dust and wanted to put it in a novel. But a novel is fiction. My second important point is to tell you how I change what happened in real life. Sometimes I change so as not to encroach on people who are still alive, such as reinventing the grandfather's second family. But the main reason I change is to deepen the tensions which are at the heart of the novel. We're talking about a split family. In the Pacitti family, there was a sister who was left behind in Cassino in the care of an aunt. But I change her totally. I call her Gabriella, a rebel, resentful of the family in Scotland. She becomes a fascist supporter and falls in love with a member of the fascist youth. As the war progresses, she becomes homeless and starving, fleeing the relentless bombing. But the biggest change I make is the one I make to the life of my main character, Antonio. It's in the part of the novel that takes place in the Second World War. Of course, the tensions of being an immigrant, of living between two states, are at their worst when the birth country and the adopted country are at war. In Britain, as soon as Mussolini declared war in June 1940, there was rioting and looting of Italian shops. British Italian males suffered internment and worse. In the novel, I show what a shock this was for children of Italian immigrant families who thought of themselves as British. And I also show this crisis of identity playing out in Italy. The real-life Antonio did serve in the British Army, but I changed the story, sending Antonio, my main character, back to his birthplace Cassino as a soldier in the British Army. Cassino, with its high mountain crowned by St. Benedict's Monastery, was where the Allied advance was stalled for months. Which brings me to my third major point, which is that the events of this novel, set in the first half of the 20th century, are disturbingly relevant to what's happening today. I was planning this novel when my husband Antonio Pacitti was still alive, and we were both engaging with an alarming international situation. There was the war in Afghanistan, the horrors of Guantanamo detention camp. This is one of his drawings that appeared in our joint publication Guantanamo. And there was the invasion of Iraq, billed as a war of liberation, but which, like the war in Afghanistan, created a troubled post-war legacy. When my character Antonio arrives at his birthplace Cassino as a British soldier, he sees himself as a liberator. He's happy that he has returned to drive the fascists, the occupying German army, out of Italy. And this is personal, because a fascist regime exiled his family when he was a tiny child. But then he sees Cassino and its world-famous monastery flattened by bombs. Italians are treated as inferior and forced to labour. They are homeless, starving, and hiding in caves. He's there in his British Army uniform, but he's also identifying with the suffering Italians. Here are 4 monotypes done by the real-life Antonio Pacitti, monotypes done during the Iraq War. But displacement, saturation bombing, and the horrors of military rule were also happening in Italy during the Second World War. And today our screens are full of displaced people and the horrors of conflict in Gaza, Ukraine, and elsewhere. So what the characters undergo in my novel feels alarmingly contemporary. The novel raises questions. Is it liberation when the native population suffers so much? When you destroy an iconic building that holds their hopes and identity? And what kind of country will emerge after the war? Antonio's mother had given him a task to find his sister Gabriella, who is missing in a huge war zone. There is so much anger on her side. Her brother is part of the occupying Allied army. And when she was a small child, Antonio, although younger than her, was taken to Glasgow and she was left behind. She never forgave him or her parents for that desertion. They do finally confront each other. It's a story of exile, loss, and separation. But it's also a story of resilience, new identities, and love in many forms.